The Louisiana parish records from Street James contain a marriage certificate dated April 3, 1853, that local clergy reportedly refused to file for 6 months. The document legally binds Marguerite Devereaux, daughter of one of the wealthiest sugar planters in the state, to a man whose property value was listed at $1,800 in her father's ledger just 3 days before the ceremony. The marriage violated no law, sparked no public scandal, and appeared in no newspaper announcement. What made this legal union so disturbing that it was hidden from polite society, whispered about in slave quarters, and deliberately obscured in family records? The answer involves a father's cold calculation, a daughter whose body betrayed her at the worst possible moments, and a transaction that would end with a hurricane, 11 deaths, and a mystery that Louisiana authorities would spend decades trying to explain away. The truth was systematically buried. Witness accounts contradict each other in ways that suggest coordination. Church records show alterations made years after the fact, and certain pages describing what happened at Plantation that autumn were removed so cleanly that archivists believe someone with official authority destroyed them deliberately. Before we go deeper into what happened between Marguerite Devereaux and the man her father chose for her, I need you to do something. Subscribe to The Sealed Room and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm always curious where people are when they discover these buried pieces of American history that nobody talks about. Now let me tell you about Marguerite Devereaux and the arrangement that would haunt Louisiana for generations. The scandal that would eventually consume the Devereaux name didn't begin with romance or rebellion. It began with a seizure in the middle of a dinner party. Plantation stretched across 2,400 acres of prime sugarcane land along the Mississippi River, in that fertile crescent where fortunes were built on forced labor and maintained through carefully constructed respectability. By 1853, Louisiana had become the wealthiest state in the Union per capita, its economy built entirely on sugar and the bodies of enslaved people who died cutting it. The Devereaux family had arrived in 1809 French Creoles who'd fled Haiti after the Revolution, carrying whatever wealth they could salvage and a bone-deep terror of slave uprisings. They'd rebuilt their fortune through sugar, their mansion through slave labor, and their reputation through the kind of rigid social performance that Creole society demanded. Philippe Devereaux owned 127 enslaved people by 1853. A number that placed him among the parish elite. His wife, Celeste, had died from yellow fever in 1847, leaving him with their only child, Marguerite, born in 1835. The girl had grown up in luxury that would have seemed obscene to most Americans, surrounded by wealth that came from grinding human beings into profit margins, calculated down to the pound of sugar produced per lash of the whip. But Marguerite carried something that made all that wealth meaningless in the marriage market that was her only acceptable future. She had epilepsy. The seizures had started when she was 12. The first one happened during Mass, her body convulsing in the pew while other parishioners recoiled in horror. The priest had called it demonic possession. The doctor called it falling sickness. Philippe called it a catastrophe. In 1853 Louisiana, epilepsy in a woman was understood as evidence of moral weakness, mental deficiency, or supernatural corruption. Medical theory held that it was hereditary, that it indicated fundamental flaws in bloodline and character. More practically, it made Marguerite unmarriageable. No family would accept a bride whose children might inherit her condition, whose episodes might humiliate her husband in public, whose very existence suggested something wrong in the Devereaux blood. Philippe had tried to hide it. Between 1849 and 1852, he'd arranged 7 potential matches, each one carefully orchestrated to minimize Marguerite's time in public, to control situations where her seizures might manifest. But secrecy was impossible in a society built on gossip and surveillance. Word spread. a daughter who convulsed, who lost control of her body, who foamed at the mouth and spoke in tongues during episodes. The rumors grew more baroque with each retelling. The final attempt had been in January 1853. A widower from New Orleans, desperate enough to consider a bride with a substantial dowry, had witnessed Marguerite seized during dinner. She'd been 19 years old, sitting at her father's table in a dress that cost more than most Louisiana families earned in 6 months, when her vision had started to blur. She'd excused herself, tried to reach the hallway, collapsed before she made it to the door. The widower had left that same night. Within a week, every eligible family in a 100-mile radius knew that Marguerite Devereaux was damaged goods. After that, something had broken in Philippe. Neighbors noticed he stopped attending social functions, stopped discussing his daughter's prospects, stopped pretending this problem had conventional solutions. Marguerite retreated into Bellariv's vast mansion, spending her days in the library or the music room, visible to the enslaved people who served her, but increasingly invisible to white society. The plantation itself ran on a brutality that was extreme even by Louisiana standards. Sugar cultivation required more intensive labor than cotton, more precise timing, more punishment to extract maximum productivity. Philippe employed 3 overseers who competed to demonstrate their commitment to discipline. The enslaved population worked 16-hour days during grinding season, died regularly from exhaustion and industrial accidents, and were replaced through purchases at New Orleans slave markets. Among the enslaved population was a man called Matthias. His African name had been beaten out of him before he was 10 years old. Matthias stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, possessed physical strength that made him invaluable during harvest, and had survived 23 years of bondage through a combination of intelligence and careful self-erasure. He made himself useful without making himself threatening, showed strength without showing defiance, demonstrated competence while hiding the full extent of his capabilities. Philippe had purchased Matthias in 1847 specifically for his size and strength, paying premium price for a man who could do the work of 2 field hands. It was a purely economic calculation. Matthias's value was measured in tons of sugar processed, in hours worked, in his ability to survive conditions that killed smaller men. What Philippe didn't know, what the system prevented him from knowing, was that Matthias could read. He'd learned from a slaved woman who'd been taught by Quakers before being sold south, who'd passed that dangerous knowledge to a handful of trusted people before she died. Matthias had been reading everything he could access for 15 years, teaching himself through scraps of newspaper used as kindling, through books left carelessly within reach, through careful observation of how white people used written language to maintain power. He'd also been watching Marguerite for 2 years, not with any romantic intention, but with the careful attention enslaved people paid to masters' families, looking for weaknesses that might create opportunities or threats that might require defensive strategy. He'd seen her seizures, he'd seen how white society reacted to them, and he'd recognized something that apparently nobody else had noticed. The seizures followed patterns. They came more frequently when Marguerite was stressed, when she'd been denied food, when the barometric pressure dropped before storms. She wasn't possessed or insane. She was sick with something that had observable triggers and predictable progressions. This observation meant nothing practically. Matthias had no power to help her, no ability to suggest treatment, no standing to offer comfort. But he'd filed the information away, adding it to his careful catalogue of knowledge about the white family, whose whims determined whether he lived or died. In February 1853, Philippe Devereaux began staying up late in his study, drinking imported brandy and reviewing his options. His ledgers told a stark story. Marguerite would inherit Bellarive when he died, but an unmarried woman couldn't run a sugar plantation alone. Society wouldn't permit it, and more practically, she'd be prey to every confidence man and predatory male relative in Louisiana. He needed to secure her future, but every conventional path was blocked by her epilepsy, by the seizures that marked her as fundamentally unsuitable for the only role her society offered women of her class. On March 3rd, 1853, Philippe called his head overseer into his study. What he proposed was so unusual that the overseer initially thought he'd misheard. Philippe wanted to arrange a breeding program. Specifically, he wanted Marguerite bred to the strongest, healthiest enslaved man on the plantation, with the goal of producing children who would be enslaved from birth, who would inherit Matthias's strength and serve as permanent labor on Bellerive. The logic was coldly economic. If Marguerite couldn't marry conventionally, she could still produce heirs. If those heirs were legally enslaved because their father was enslaved, they'd add value to the estate rather than threatening Philippe's control. Marguerite would have the social protection of motherhood, while Philippe would gain valuable property and solve the succession problem. But there was more to the plan, details that revealed how carefully Philippe had thought this through, how desperately he needed this to work. The arrangement would be formalized through marriage, giving it legal legitimacy that would prevent accusations of sexual exploitation. Louisiana law permitted marriages between free people and enslaved people under specific circumstances, though such marriages were rare and socially toxic. The marriage would make any children born to Marguerite legally enslaved because they'd follow the status of their enslaved father, but it would also give Marguerite permanent protection from accusations of immorality. Matthias would be the groom because his size suggested he'd produce strong children, because his intelligence meant he could be trusted with certain responsibilities, and because his complete lack of social standing meant he could never challenge Philippe's authority. The overseer asked the obvious question, what if Matthias refused? Philippe's answer was simple and devastating. Matthias wouldn't be given the option to refuse. He'd be told this was happening, and if he resisted, he'd be sold to the sugar plantations further south, where enslaved people typically died within 3 years. On March 15th, Philippe Devereaux called Matthias into his study. Matthias entered Philippe's study expecting punishment. Enslaved people weren't summoned to the master's private quarters unless violence was imminent. He'd been bracing himself for accusation, for some invented transgression that would justify a whipping or worse. Instead, he found Philippe seated behind his mahogany desk, looking at Matthias with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was calculation. The look a man gives property he's deciding how to use. Philippe spoke without preamble. He told Matthias he was going to marry Marguerite. Not court her, not ask her permission. Marry her, in a legal ceremony that would bind them permanently. The marriage would give Marguerite the protection of a husband, while giving Philippe control over any children they produced, who would be enslaved from birth under Louisiana law. The silence that followed was complete. Matthias stood frozen, trying to process words that seemed to come from some nightmare logic where the fundamental rules of their world had been inverted and corrupted. White masters didn't marry their daughters to enslaved men. These things didn't happen. They couldn't happen within any social order, Matthias understood. Philippe kept talking, laying out terms like he was discussing crop rotation. Matthias would marry Marguerite in a private ceremony. He'd move into the main house, into rooms prepared for him. He'd be given certain privileges, better food, exemption from field labor. But he'd remain enslaved, remain property, remain subject to Philippe's absolute authority. Most importantly, any children born to Marguerite would follow Matthias's status. They'd be enslaved from birth, would inherit Matthias's strength and Marguerite's white features, would serve Bellerive their entire lives. Philippe would finally have heirs he could control completely, who could never challenge his authority or make claims on his estate. Matthias's first coherent thought, when he could finally think at all, was that this wasn't about Marguerite's protection. This was about Philippe's absolute control. He was breeding human beings like livestock, using his daughter as broodmare and an enslaved man as stud, creating a permanent enslaved class that would be family and property simultaneously. Matthias asked what would happen if he refused. Philippe's answer was exactly what Matthias had expected. Refusal would mean sale to the deep sugar parishes, where enslaved people were worked to death in 3 to 5 years. Acceptance would mean relative comfort, protection from the worst plantation brutalities, and the knowledge that any children he fathered would grow up enslaved but alive. It wasn't a choice. It was the illusion of choice, wrapped in language that suggested Matthias had agency when really he had none. Matthias asked for time to think. Philippe gave him until sunset, then dismissed him with a wave, as if they'd just discussed equipment repairs instead of fundamentally perverting every social boundary that supposedly gave their world structure. Matthias walked out of that study directly to the tool shed where he stored carpentry equipment, work he did during rare hours when he wasn't cutting cane. He stood among wood and metal, trying to make sense of what had been proposed. He thought about Marguerite, about the white woman he'd been carefully not thinking about for 2 years, about seizures he'd witnessed from a distance, about the cruelty of a society that declared her worthless because her body sometimes betrayed her. He thought about what it would mean to touch her, to be commanded to produce children with her, to build something that looked like family but was actually an elaborate prison for everyone involved. He thought about the children, about bringing enslaved people into the world deliberately, knowing they'd inherit bondage from their father and never escape it, about whether that was morally different from the random horror of enslaved people having children who were automatically enslaved under the system's existing logic. When Matthias finally went to find Philippe that evening, he had no good options, only the terrible calculus of choosing which horror to accept. But Philippe had one more piece of information. Matthias wouldn't be telling Marguerite about this arrangement. Philippe would handle that conversation himself. Matthias was simply to appear at the ceremony and fulfill his role. The next morning, Philippe called Marguerite into his study. She came expecting another lecture about her condition, about her failure to control the seizures, about the burden she placed on the family name. What she got instead was her father's plan, delivered in the same business-like tone he'd used with Matthias. She would marry Matthias, the large field hand Philippe owned. The marriage would be legal but private. She would produce children who would be enslaved from birth. She would have the social protection of being a married woman and mother, while Philippe would have heirs he could control completely. Marguerite's first response was physical. She felt her vision starting to blur, felt the familiar warning signs of a seizure approaching. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus, to push back against the episode through sheer will. She couldn't seize now, couldn't give her father more evidence of her weakness. When she could speak, her voice was carefully controlled. She asked why her father thought she'd agree to this. Philippe's answer revealed he'd anticipated resistance. He told her she had no alternatives. No one would marry her conventionally. If she remained unmarried, she'd be dependent on male relatives after Philippe died. And those relatives had already made clear they wanted nothing to do with her. She'd end up in an asylum or poorhouse, her inheritance seized by distant cousins, her life reduced to charity and pity. Marriage to Matthias gave her something resembling autonomy. She'd remain at Bellerive, control the household, raise children who'd be permanently attached to the plantation. She'd have purpose and protection, even if society would judge the arrangement harshly. Marguerite asked what would happen to the children. Would they know she was their mother? Would they call her mother, or would they call her mistress? Philippe's answer was brutally honest. They'd know she was their mother, but they'd be enslaved regardless. Louisiana law was clear. Children of enslaved fathers were enslaved, no matter who the mother was. They'd work the fields, serve the house, live in the quarters with other enslaved people. But they'd be family. They'd be hers in ways that mattered, even if the law said they were Philippe's property. Marguerite asked about Matthias. Had he agreed to this? Philippe said yes, though he didn't mention the threats that had secured that agreement. What Philippe didn't tell Marguerite was that Matthias had asked one question during their final conversation. He'd asked if Marguerite knew about her father's plan, if she'd agreed to this, if she understood what was being done to both of them. Philippe had lied. He'd told Matthias that Marguerite had suggested the arrangement herself, that she'd specifically requested Matthias because she'd observed his intelligence and strength. It was a strategic lie designed to make Matthias believe Marguerite had agency in this decision, that she wasn't just another victim of Philippe's control. Marguerite spent the next 2 days in her room, not eating, not sleeping, trying to find some escape route that didn't exist. She considered refusing, but her father had made clear that refusal would mean institutionalization. She considered running away. But where could she go? She had no money of her own, no skills that would support independent life, and seizures that made travel dangerous. She also thought about Matthias, about the man she'd seen working from her window but had never spoken to. She'd noticed him because he was impossible not to notice, his size making him visible across the plantation. But she'd never considered him as a person, never wondered what he thought or felt or wanted. Now she was being told to marry him, to bear his children, to build something that would look like family, while actually being an elaborate breeding program designed to produce enslaved heirs. On the third day, Marguerite told her father she'd agree, but only if she could speak with Matthias first. Alone, without Philippe present to control the conversation. Philippe allowed it, seeing no harm in letting them meet before the ceremony. The meeting took place in the library, the same room where Marguerite had spent so much time hiding from white society. Matthias entered carefully, his posture showing the caution enslaved people learned early. Never presume, never relax, never forget that white people held absolute power over black bodies. Marguerite was standing by the window, her back to the door. When she turned to face him, Matthias saw something he hadn't expected. She looked terrified. Not of him, of the situation, of what her father had orchestrated, of the impossible position they'd both been maneuvered into. She spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. She told him she knew this wasn't his choice, that her father had forced this on both of them. She wanted him to know that she understood he was as much a victim of Philippe's plan as she was. Matthias's response was careful. He told her he appreciated that acknowledgement, but that victim wasn't quite accurate. She'd been trapped by social expectations and medical stigma. He'd been trapped by bondage and the threat of death. Their situations weren't equivalent. Marguerite accepted the correction without argument. She said she wanted to know what he needed from her to make this tolerable, what boundaries he wanted, how they could navigate this arrangement without destroying each other. The question surprised Matthias. White people didn't ask enslaved people what they needed. They gave orders and expected obedience. He told her the truth. He needed her to understand that marriage wouldn't make him free, that sleeping in the main house wouldn't make him equal, that any children they had would be enslaved because of him. He needed her to never forget that power difference, never use her whiteness as weapon, never pretend their forced intimacy was something other than what it was. Marguerite's response revealed she'd been thinking about the same dynamics. She told him she couldn't promise not to hurt him because the entire structure of their arrangement was designed to hurt both of them. But she could promise to try to be honest, to recognize when she was exercising power over him, to not pretend their marriage was normal or right, or anything other than her father's grotesque solution to interconnected problems. They talked for 2 hours, working through details and boundaries. They agreed the marriage would be real in legal terms but not in romantic terms. They'd share space but not affection unless both wanted it. They'd cooperate to survive Philippe's plan while acknowledging the fundamental injustice of what was being done to them. Matthias asked one more question before leaving. Did she know what happened to children born to enslaved fathers? Marguerite said she knew. Her father had been explicit. The children would be enslaved, would work Bellarive, would never be free. Matthias asked if she could live with that, if she could bring enslaved children into the world, knowing what their lives would be. Marguerite had no answer. She just shook her head, tears finally breaking through her careful composure. The wedding took place on April 3rd, 1853, in Philippe's study. A Catholic priest who owed Philippe substantial gambling debts performed the ceremony, reading the words quickly, avoiding eye contact with either bride or groom. The marriage was legal under Louisiana law, which permitted such unions, even though they were socially explosive. Philippe had paid the priest $200 for his participation and his permanent silence. The ceremony was recorded in parish records, but filed in a way that made it nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Marguerite Devereaux became Marguerite Matthias, though she'd continue using Devereaux in public. Matthias remained enslaved, gained no surname, and was moved into the main house that same night, into rooms that connected to Marguerite's quarters. The enslaved community wasn't told directly, but they knew something had shifted. Matthias disappeared from the quarters, reappeared giving orders he'd never been authorized to give before, and was seen entering and leaving the main house at will. The first month of the marriage passed in careful routine. Matthias occupied rooms adjacent to Marguerite's, sleeping separately because neither was ready for the intimacy their arrangement theoretically demanded. He began managing certain plantation operations under Philippe's supervision, giving orders to people who'd worked beside him weeks earlier, navigating the impossible position of being simultaneously enslaved and elevated. Marguerite retreated further into the mansion's interior, appearing only when necessary, avoiding the white society that would eventually learn about her marriage and judge it accordingly. She and Matthias had dinner together each evening, formal meals where they discussed neutral topics and avoided acknowledging what Philippe expected them to do, what biological function their marriage was designed to serve. The enslaved population understood something fundamental had changed, but the details remained murky. Some believed Matthias had been given special status as a driver or overseer. Others suspected something darker, something that violated the boundaries their world supposedly maintained. A woman named Celeste, who'd known Matthias since childhood, confronted him directly in early May. She found him in the carpentry shed and asked a simple question: "What happened to you?" Matthias told her the truth. Philippe had married him to Marguerite. He was still enslaved, still property, but now he lived in the main house and was expected to produce children who'd be enslaved from birth. Celeste's response was immediate and angry. She called it what it was: breeding. The same thing planters did with horses and cattle, now applied to human beings with the veneer of marriage to make it seem less monstrous. She asked Matthias how he could agree to it, how he could participate in creating enslaved children deliberately. Matthias had no defense. He told her about Philippe's threats, about the choice between this arrangement and sail to sugar parishes where he'd die within years. He told her he'd chosen survival, even though survival meant complicity in something horrifying. Celeste understood the impossible calculation, but understanding didn't equal forgiveness. She told Matthias that his children would grow up enslaved because of decisions he'd made, that he'd be their father and their master's property simultaneously, that they'd know he'd chosen his own life over their freedom. The accusation haunted Matthias because it was accurate. His survival was being purchased with his children's bondage. But by June, Marguerite still wasn't pregnant. Philippe was growing impatient, making increasingly explicit comments about the purpose of the marriage, about his expectations for biological results. In late June, he called both Matthias and Marguerite into his study and told them directly that the marriage needed to be consummated, that he expected pregnancy within 3 months, that their arrangement only had value if it produced enslaved heirs. The conversation was mortifying for everyone involved. Philippe discussing his daughter's fertility like she was livestock. Marguerite forced to sit quietly while her father outlined timetables for conception. Matthias expected to perform on command while remaining enslaved and powerless. After that meeting, Marguerite and Matthias had their first real conversation about the physical expectations of their marriage. It happened late at night in Marguerite's room, both of them sitting at opposite ends of a sofa, maintaining careful distance. Marguerite spoke first. She said she understood what her father expected, but that she couldn't force Matthias into intimacy, couldn't use her position to coerce him into something that should require mutual consent. Matthias's response revealed the complexity of consent within slavery. He told her that mutual consent wasn't possible between enslaved and free people, that any intimacy between them would be structurally coerced, regardless of their personal feelings. But he also understood that refusing would mean Philippe would simply force the issue more explicitly, would turn their marriage into something even more obviously violent. They agreed to try to build something that might eventually include physical intimacy, but only if both wanted it, only if it came from genuine connection rather than Philippe's commands. Over the following weeks, they spent more time together. They read in the library, Marguerite, discovering that Matthias could read, could discuss literature and philosophy with sophistication that destroyed any assumption about enslaved people's intellectual capacity. They talked about their childhoods, about memories and losses, about what their lives had been before Philippe forced them into this arrangement. Marguerite told Matthias about her first seizure, about the terror of losing control of her body, about how society had used her medical condition to declare her fundamentally defective. Matthias told Marguerite about watching his mother sold away when he was 8, about the permanent wound that separation created, about what it meant to be property rather than person. Something developed between them, not quite love, but genuine affection. Recognition that they were both victims of systems larger than themselves, both trying to survive circumstances they hadn't chosen. In August, they became physically intimate. It happened without planning, without dramatic decision. Just two people who'd been forced into proximity, finding comfort in each other despite the impossible circumstances. Marguerite became pregnant in September. When she told Matthias, his first response wasn't joy or fear. It was guilt. He told her he was sorry, that he'd made her pregnant, knowing their child would be enslaved from birth, that he'd participated in Philippe's breeding program, even though he'd known it was monstrous. Marguerite's response surprised him. She said the guilt wasn't his alone to carry, that she'd made the same choice, that they'd both chosen survival and connection over resistance and isolation. Their child would be enslaved because of structural violence, not because of personal moral failure. But that rationalization didn't make the reality less horrifying. Philippe was delighted with the pregnancy. He began making plans for the child's future, discussing what work they'd be trained for, how their labor would benefit Bellerive. He spoke about his grandchild the way other planters spoke about promising livestock. The pregnancy was difficult. Marguerite's seizures increased in frequency, possibly triggered by hormonal changes. She had episodes where she'd lose consciousness for minutes at a time, where Matthias would hold her through convulsions, terrified she'd hurt herself or the baby. Louisiana doctors knew almost nothing about treating epilepsy, and less about treating it during pregnancy. The physician Philippe hired suggested bloodletting and laudanum, treatments that Marguerite refused after Matthias quietly told her they might harm the baby. Instead, they developed their own management strategies. Matthias learned to recognize warning signs before seizures, learned to guide Marguerite to safe spaces, learned to protect her during episodes. The intimacy required for this care was different from sexual intimacy. It was vulnerability and trust built through repeated crisis. The enslaved community watched Marguerite's pregnancy with mixed reactions. Some pitied the child, who'd be born into bondage despite having a white mother. Others resented the special treatment Matthias received, the way he'd escaped field labor through marriage while they remained in grinding poverty. Celeste confronted Matthias again in November. She asked if he'd thought about what he'd tell his child when they were old enough to understand their situation, when they realized their father could have chosen death over participating in their enslavement. Matthias had no answer. He told Celeste he thought about it constantly, that the guilt was crushing, that he didn't know how to justify his choices even to himself. Celeste's response was more compassionate than her earlier anger. She told him that enslaved people made impossible choices every day, that survival sometimes required complicity in systems they hated, that she understood even if she couldn't forgive. Then she told Matthias something that would change everything. She said there were rumors of Union sentiment growing in parts of Louisiana, whispers about northern armies that might eventually march south and break slavery. She said some enslaved people were planning to run when the opportunity came, to escape north where freedom might be possible. She asked if Matthias would run if he could, if he'd take Marguerite and their child and try to reach free territory. Matthias said he'd thought about it, but that running seemed impossible. Philippe watched him constantly, and Marguerite's seizures made long-distance travel dangerous. More fundamentally, running would mean leaving behind everyone else enslaved at Bellerive, would mean saving himself while abandoning the community. Celeste told him that staying meant watching his child grow up enslaved, meant participating in Philippe's breeding program indefinitely, meant choosing complicity over resistance. The conversation ended without resolution, just the ongoing tension between survival and resistance that defined enslaved people's lives. Marguerite gave birth on March 12, 1854, after 18 hours of labor. The baby was a girl, born healthy despite the difficult pregnancy. She had Marguerite's fine features and Matthias's darker complexion, a physical embodiment of their impossible union. Philippe named her Louisa, recorded her birth in his ledger as enslaved property valued at $300, and made clear she'd be raised in the quarters with other enslaved children once she was weaned. That was when Marguerite broke. She'd endured the marriage, the pregnancy, the social isolation, but being told she'd have to surrender her infant daughter to the slave quarters, that she couldn't raise her own child, that Louisa would be property before she was family, was too much. She told Philippe she refused. The child would remain with her, would be raised in the main house, would be treated as family regardless of her legal status. Philippe's response was cold and explicit. Louisa was enslaved under Louisiana law. She was his property, not Marguerite's daughter. She would be raised where he decided, work where he commanded, and live according to his determination. When Marguerite continued to resist, Philippe threatened to sell Louisa. Louisiana law permitted owners to sell enslaved infants separately from their mothers. If Marguerite wouldn't cooperate, he'd simply sell the child to someone else and force Marguerite to produce another baby who might be more compliant. Matthias witnessed this confrontation in silence. He had no legal standing to intervene, no power to protect his daughter, no ability to prevent Philippe from doing whatever he wanted with their child. That night, Marguerite had the worst seizure she'd experienced in years. She convulsed for nearly 10 minutes, her body shaking violently, foam at her mouth. Matthias held her through it, terrified she'd die, leaving Louisa completely vulnerable to Philippe's control. When the seizure finally ended, Marguerite lay exhausted and barely conscious. Matthias held their daughter, looking at her tiny face, knowing she'd grow up enslaved because of decisions he'd made, because he'd chosen survival over resistance. He made a decision that night. He told Marguerite, when she was coherent enough to understand, that they needed to find a way to free Louisa, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. Marguerite agreed immediately. She said she'd been thinking the same thing, that she couldn't watch her daughter grow up enslaved, that motherhood had changed something fundamental in her understanding of what she could accept. They began planning in secret, discussing possibilities in whispered conversations late at night. They had limited options and enormous obstacles, but they had one advantage Philippe hadn't anticipated. Marguerite was still legally free, still had certain rights under Louisiana law, still possessed agency that enslaved people lacked. Over the following months, they developed a desperate plan. Marguerite would claim that Louisa's father was a white man, that the pregnancy had resulted from assault by a white overseer who'd since left the plantation. Under Louisiana law, if a free white woman claimed her child was fathered by a white man rather than an enslaved man, the child followed the mother's status and was born free. It was a lie that required denying Matthias's paternity, that required Marguerite to publicly claim she'd been raped, that required constructing an elaborate fiction to work around laws designed to prevent exactly what they were attempting. More fundamentally, the lie would probably fail. Philippe knew the truth, and he'd fight any attempt to change Louisa's legal status. But Marguerite and Matthias were willing to try anything that might give their daughter a chance at freedom. In June 1854, Marguerite filed legal papers claiming Louisa's father was an overseer named James Crawford who'd left Bellerive in December 1853. She provided a sworn statement describing assault, included testimony from enslaved women who'd been coached to support her story, and requested that Louisa's status be changed from enslaved to free. Philippe responded with fury. He filed counterpapers asserting that Louisa was the product of Marguerite's legal marriage to Matthias, that Marguerite was lying to defraud him of property, that her claim should be dismissed immediately. The legal battle attracted attention Marguerite and Matthias hadn't wanted. Newspapers began reporting on the case, framing it as scandalous evidence of moral decay among Louisiana planters. White society was horrified by different aspects of the story. Some focused on Marguerite's claim of assault, others on her marriage to an enslaved man, others on the underlying question of whether enslaved fathers could produce free children through white mothers. The case went to parish court in August 1854. The courtroom was packed with spectators who'd come to witness what the local newspaper called the most scandalous case in Louisiana legal history. Marguerite sat at the plaintiff's table, holding Louisa, now 5 months old. Matthias wasn't permitted in the courtroom. Enslaved people couldn't testify in cases involving white people, couldn't even be present except as evidence. Philippe sat across the aisle with his legal team, 3 of the most expensive attorneys in the state, all hired to protect his property rights against his daughter's attempt to free her child. The trial lasted 4 days. Marguerite's lawyers presented her testimony about James Crawford, the fictional overseer. They called enslaved women who'd been carefully prepared to confirm that Crawford had been alone with Marguerite on multiple occasions, that he'd exhibited inappropriate behavior, that his sudden departure from Bellerive had been suspicious. Philippe's attorneys destroyed the story methodically. They proved Crawford had never existed, that no one by that name had ever worked at Bellerive, that employment records showed no overseer departing in December 1853. They presented the marriage certificate binding Marguerite to Matthias, proved the marriage had been consummated, demonstrated that Louisa's birth occurred exactly 9 months after the wedding night. Most damaging was testimony from the priest who'd performed the ceremony. He confirmed that he'd married Marguerite Devereaux to the enslaved man Matthias, that Philippe had specifically requested this union, that the marriage was legal under Louisiana law, even if it was morally questionable. The priest's testimony made clear that Marguerite had lied, that her assault claim was fabricated, that she was attempting to defraud her father of legal property through perjury. On the 4th day, the judge ruled against Marguerite. He found that Louisa was the legitimate child of Marguerite's legal marriage to Matthias, that she therefore inherited her father's enslaved status, that she was Philippe's property under Louisiana law. He also fined Marguerite $500 for perjury and court costs, effectively bankrupting her since Philippe controlled all her finances. But the judge added something unexpected. He criticized Philippe's arrangement as morally repugnant, even if legally permissible, and suggested that marriages between free white women and enslaved men violated the spirit of Louisiana's racial laws, even when they didn't violate the letter. He recommended the legislature close this loophole to prevent similar cases in the future. The ruling devastated Marguerite and Matthias. They'd known their case was weak, but they'd hoped some judge might find their situation sympathetic enough to rule creatively. Instead, they'd lost completely, and now Louisiana was considering new laws specifically designed to prevent other white women from marrying enslaved men. Philippe took Louisa from Marguerite that same day. He moved the baby to the quarters, assigned an enslaved woman to nurse her, and made clear that Marguerite would see her daughter only when Philippe permitted it. Marguerite tried to resist physically, holding Louisa and refusing to release her. Philippe called in overseers who forcibly removed the child from her arms. Marguerite screamed, fought, had a seizure in the middle of the struggle. When she regained consciousness, Louisa was gone. Matthias wasn't permitted to intervene. He stood watching while his daughter was taken to the slave quarters, powerless to protect her, unable to do anything except survive the moment and plan for whatever came next. That night, Marguerite told Matthias they needed to run, take Louisa and escape north, accept the enormous risks of flight, rather than watch their daughter grow up enslaved. Matthias pointed out the practical obstacles. They had no money, no contacts in free territory, no knowledge of escape routes. Marguerite's seizures made long-distance travel dangerous. Louisa was an infant who'd need constant care, and Philippe would pursue them with every resource available, would hire slave catchers, would use legal mechanisms to reclaim his property. Marguerite said she didn't care about obstacles. She'd rather die trying to free their daughter than live watching her grow up in bondage. Over the following weeks, they began preparing for escape. Marguerite sold jewelry secretly, accumulating $200 in cash. Matthias made contact with Celeste and other enslaved people who had knowledge about underground railroad routes, about sympathetic people who might hide fugitives, about dangers to avoid. They planned to leave during hurricane season, when storms would make pursuit more difficult. They'd take Louisa, travel by night, head for New Orleans, where they might find Quakers or free black communities who'd help them reach northern states. But Celeste brought them information that complicated everything. She told Matthias that other enslaved people on Bellerive were planning their own escape, that they'd been organizing for months, that they intended to run during the next major hurricane, when the plantation would be in chaos. She asked if Matthias and Marguerite would help the others escape, would use Marguerite's whiteness and resources to assist more people than just their own family. It was an impossible request. Adding more people to their escape plan would make it exponentially more dangerous, would increase the chances of capture for everyone involved. But it also offered a chance to do something meaningful, to free more than just one child, to resist the system that had destroyed so many lives. Marguerite and Matthias argued about it for days. Marguerite wanted to focus solely on Louisa, to maximize their daughter's chances, even if it meant abandoning others. Matthias felt the pull of obligation to the enslaved community, to people who'd suffered alongside him for years. They finally agreed to a compromise. They'd help organize the mass escape, would coordinate timing and provide resources. But they'd also prioritize Louisa's safety, would separate from the larger group if necessary to protect their daughter. The hurricane they'd been waiting for arrived on September 8th, 1854. It came from the Gulf, with terrifying speed, winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, storm surge flooding the lower fields. Philippe ordered everyone to shelter in the main house and the sturdier outbuildings, standard procedure during major storms. The chaos was exactly what the escape plan required. Marguerite and Matthias moved through the plantation during the storm's worst hours, finding the 15 people who'd agreed to run. They distributed supplies, food, water, money Marguerite had accumulated. They reviewed the route, the plan to head for New Orleans under cover of the storm, to scatter in different directions to make pursuit harder. But something went wrong. One of the overseers, a man named Talbot, discovered the escape in progress. He'd been checking on enslaved people supposedly sheltering in the barn when he found them preparing to leave, saw supplies and coordination that made their intent obvious. Talbot raised the alarm, bringing Philippe and other white men despite the ongoing hurricane. There was a confrontation in the barn, enslaved people trying to escape, white men trying to prevent flight, violence erupting in the middle of the storm. What happened next remains disputed. The official account says enslaved people attacked the white men with tools and weapons, that the whites acted in self-defense, that several enslaved people were killed while resisting lawful authority. Unofficial accounts from enslaved witnesses tell a different story. They say Talbot opened fire immediately, that he shot an unarmed woman named Sarah who'd been holding her infant child, that other whites joined in killing people who were trying to flee rather than fight. The most reliable evidence suggests something in between. Violence from both sides, chaos and terror, people dying in a barn during a hurricane while the storm tore apart the world outside. When the violence ended, 11 people were dead, 7 enslaved people, including Sarah and her infant, 3 white men, including Talbot, and Celeste, shot while trying to protect Matthias from an overseer who'd recognized him as the ringleader. Matthias survived with a gunshot wound to his shoulder. Marguerite survived unharmed. Louisa survived because Marguerite had kept her in the main house, hadn't brought her to the barn during the escape attempt. Philippe survived, his fury at the attempted escape overwhelming any relief that the hurricane hadn't destroyed his property completely. The aftermath was brutal. Philippe had the surviving enslaved people who'd participated in the escape attempt whipped publicly, 20 lashes each, standard punishment for attempted flight. 2 died from the whipping, their bodies already weakened by the violence in the barn. Matthias received 30 lashes, the additional punishment reflecting Philippe's particular anger at a man who'd been given special privileges and had used them to organize rebellion. Marguerite was confined to her room under guard, Philippe declaring her mentally unfit, threatening to have her committed to an asylum for the insane unless she cooperated completely with his authority. The hurricane damage to Bellerive was extensive. Fields flooded, buildings destroyed, equipment wrecked. Philippe needed months to restore the plantation to working condition. The 11 deaths during the escape attempt created labor shortages that complicated recovery efforts. But Philippe had bigger problems. The escape attempt had attracted legal attention. Louisiana authorities investigated what happened, particularly the deaths of 3 white men. They needed to determine whether Philippe had adequately controlled his enslaved population, whether he'd been negligent in allowing rebellion to develop. The investigation included questioning Marguerite about her role. She was asked directly if she'd helped organize the escape attempt, if she'd provided resources to fugitives, if she'd betrayed her race and class to assist enslaved people's flight. Marguerite's response shocked investigators. She confessed everything. She described planning the escape with Matthias, distributing money and supplies, coordinating timing with the hurricane. She took full responsibility for organizing rebellion against her father's authority. The confession was legally devastating and strategically calculated. If Marguerite admitted to organizing the escape, she could be prosecuted for slave stealing and conspiracy. But prosecution would require public trial, would force Louisiana to explain how a white woman had married an enslaved man, had produced an enslaved child, had been driven to rebellion by a system that enslaved her daughter. Philippe wanted the whole situation buried. The last thing he needed was more public scrutiny of his arrangement with Marguerite and Matthias, more newspaper coverage of Louisiana's most scandalous marriage. He negotiated with authorities, offering financial compensation to the families of the dead white men in exchange for dropping investigation. He agreed to sell off the surviving enslaved people who'd participated in the escape attempt, removing troublemakers from his plantation. He promised to control Marguerite more carefully, to prevent future rebellion. The authorities accepted Philippe's proposal. The investigation was closed with findings that blamed the violence on enslaved people's unprovoked rebellion, that cleared Philippe of negligence, that recommended no further action. Marguerite and Matthias were left in an impossible position. Their escape attempt had failed catastrophically. 11 people were dead, including Celeste and others who'd trusted their leadership. The enslaved community blamed them for organizing a plan that ended in massacre. Philippe would never trust them again, never give them opportunity for another escape attempt. Most devastatingly, Louisa remained enslaved with no realistic path to freedom. In October 1854, Philippe made his final move to secure control. He announced he was selling Matthias to a sugar plantation in Terrebonne Parish, 120 miles away. The sale would separate Matthias from Marguerite and Louisa permanently, would remove the man who'd organized rebellion, would punish both Matthias and Marguerite by destroying their family. Louisiana law permitted husbands to sell their wives' enslaved property without consulting the wives. Philippe exercised this authority, finalizing the sale before Marguerite knew it was happening. Matthias was transported to Terrebonne in chains in November 1854. He had no opportunity to say goodbye to Louisa, no chance to tell his daughter he'd tried to free her, no ability to explain why he was being taken away. His last conversation with Marguerite happened the night before his sale, a hurried exchange in the hallway when guards weren't watching. He told her to survive, to protect Louisa as much as possible, to remember that the system had destroyed them, not their own failures. Marguerite told him she loved him, a truth she'd never quite articulated before. She said she was sorry for everything, for her father's plan, for the escape attempt that killed 11 people, for bringing a child into slavery. Matthias had no comfort to offer. He just held her briefly, then left before guards noticed. After Matthias's sale, Marguerite descended into depression so severe that Philippe hired physicians to monitor her. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, had seizures almost daily. The doctors diagnosed her with hysteria, recommended institutionalization. Philippe finally allowed Marguerite limited access to Louisa, hoping it would stabilize her mental state. She was permitted to see her daughter twice weekly under supervision for 1 hour at a time. These visits were torture. Louisa was being raised by enslaved women in the quarters, was learning to call Marguerite Miss Marguerite rather than mother, was growing up understanding herself as property rather than person. Marguerite tried to tell Louisa stories during their visits, tried to explain that she was her mother, that she loved her, that she'd tried to free her, but Louisa was too young to understand, and the enslaved women who cared for her made clear that Marguerite's version of events contradicted what they were teaching the child. By 1856, Louisa understood herself as enslaved, understood Marguerite as the master's daughter who'd made questionable choices, understood her father as an enslaved man who'd been sold away after organizing rebellion that killed people. The story Louisa learned was complicated and contradictory. Some people told her that Marguerite and Matthias had tried to free her, had organized escape attempt out of love. Others told her that Marguerite and Matthias had participated in Philippe's breeding program, had created an enslaved child deliberately for their own benefit. Both versions were true. Marguerite and Matthias had made impossible choices within systems designed to make good choices impossible. Philippe died in 1858 from heart disease. He left Bellerive to Marguerite, along with all enslaved people, including Louisa. Louisiana's coverture laws had been modified slightly, allowing married women some property rights if their husbands were enslaved. The modification was specifically designed to address cases like Marguerite's, where white women had married enslaved men and needed legal authority over family property. Marguerite inherited absolute power over her daughter. She could free Louisa immediately, could manumit her through legal process, could end the bondage Philippe had imposed. But Louisiana law, in 1858, made manumission nearly impossible. The state required freed people to leave Louisiana within 30 days or be re-enslaved. If Marguerite freed Louisa, she'd have to send her away, would lose her daughter to distant states where Marguerite couldn't follow because her seizures made travel too dangerous. Marguerite tried anyway. She filed manumission papers in January 1859, arguing that Louisa should be freed and allowed to remain in Louisiana under Marguerite's guardianship. The parish court denied the request. The judge ruled that Louisa was valuable property, that freeing her would deprive Louisiana of taxable wealth, that manumission served no legitimate purpose when Louisa could be kept enslaved and productive. Marguerite appealed to state courts, spent the inheritance. Philippe left fighting legal battles to free her daughter. Every court ruled against her, citing Louisiana's restrictive manumission laws, protecting the state's economic interest in maintaining slavery. By 1860, Marguerite had exhausted her legal options and her financial resources. Louisa remained enslaved, now 6 years old, working in Bellerive's main house as a servant to her own mother. The situation was grotesque beyond words. Mother and daughter living in the same house, one free and one enslaved, bound by love and separated by law, trying to build relationship across a divide that made genuine connection impossible. Then the Civil War started. Union forces occupied parts of Louisiana in 1862. Enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines, claiming freedom under military authority. The system that had seemed permanent and unbreakable was finally collapsing. Marguerite took Louisa to Union forces in April 1863, presenting her daughter to military officers and claiming she should be freed. The Union commander accepted Louisa as contraband of war, granted her protected status, but also made clear that her legal status would need to be determined after the war ended. Louisa was 8 years old, freed provisionally by military occupation rather than her mother's legal authority. Marguerite and Louisa spent the final years of the war in New Orleans, living in a cramped apartment, surviving on Marguerite's small income from sewing. They tried to build mother-daughter relationship that had been prevented by slavery, tried to create family from the wreckage of Philippe's breeding program. But the damage was permanent. Louisa had spent her formative years enslaved, had learned to see herself as property, had been taught that her mother's love was secondary to white society's legal structures. She'd also learned that her father had been sold away, that he'd tried to free her but failed, that good intentions meant nothing against systemic violence. Marguerite tried to explain the decisions she and Matthias had made, tried to help Louisa understand that they'd been trapped by circumstances beyond their control, but Louisa's response was complicated and angry. She said she understood they'd made impossible choices, but that understanding didn't erase the fact that they'd chosen to bring her into slavery, had chosen their own survival over her freedom until it was almost too late. After the war ended, Marguerite spent years trying to locate Matthias. She wrote to plantations in Terrebonne Parish, contacted freedmen's organizations, searched through records of enslaved people who died or disappeared during the war. She never found him. Matthias had either died in bondage, fled during the war's chaos, or deliberately avoided contact with the family that represented his most painful memories. Louisa grew up, married a freeman from New York, moved away from Louisiana in 1872. She maintained minimal contact with Marguerite, sending occasional letters but never visiting, never forgiving the fundamental violation of being brought into slavery by parents who claimed to love her. Marguerite died in 1881, alone in New Orleans, her epilepsy worsening over years until a final seizure killed her at age 46. She left a written account of her marriage to Matthias, of their desperate attempts to free their daughter, of the 11 people who died during the hurricane escape attempt. The account was found among her possessions after her death, read by Louisa, and destroyed. Louisa told the lawyer handling Marguerite's estate that she wanted no record of her parents' story, no documentation of the breeding program that had created her, no evidence that would force future generations to confront the grotesque complexities of their family history. But pieces of the story survived. Parish records preserved the marriage certificate. Court documents preserved details of the legal battles over Louisa's status. Newspaper archives preserved coverage of the escape attempt and its aftermath. Historians eventually reconstructed the basic facts, though interpretation remained contested. Some saw Marguerite and Matthias as victims of Philippe's cruelty, people who'd been forced into impossible situations and had tried desperately to resist. Others saw them as complicit in slavery, people who'd chosen their own survival and comfort over principled resistance, who'd brought an enslaved child into the world knowing what her life would be. Both interpretations are true. Marguerite and Matthias were victims and perpetrators simultaneously, people trapped in systems that made moral purity impossible, that forced them to choose between different kinds of harm rather than between harm and good. The story raises questions that have no satisfying answers. Should Matthias have refused Philippe's arrangement, chosen death over participating in a breeding program? Should Marguerite have refused to bear children rather than create enslaved people? Should they have attempted escape earlier, before Louisa was born, accepting the risks of flight rather than the certainty of their daughter's bondage? Or were they simply doing what humans do in impossible situations, making choices that balanced survival against resistance, love against complicity, hope against despair? What remains certain is that Louisiana's laws created the conditions for this horror, that slavery's logic required treating humans as property, that the entire social structure depended on maintaining boundaries that destroyed everyone they touched. Marguerite and Matthias crossed those boundaries, paid terrible prices, and left behind a daughter who spent her life processing the trauma of being born enslaved to parents who claimed freedom was impossible until it was almost too late. There's no redemption in this story, no moral victory, no triumph of love over evil. Just the historical fact that these things happened, that real people lived through them, that the consequences echo forward through generations who inherited wounds they didn't create. Perhaps that's the only lesson. That systems of oppression destroy everyone they touch, that individual resistance within those systems is simultaneously heroic and futile. That good intentions mean nothing when the structures themselves are designed to make goodness impossible. The 11 people who died during the hurricane escape attempt deserved better than being footnotes to someone else's tragedy. Celeste deserved better than dying to protect a man who'd gained privilege through marriage to a white woman. Sarah and her infant deserved better than being shot while fleeing bondage. And Louisa deserved better than being born into slavery by parents who loved her but couldn't protect her, who tried to free her but failed, who spent her childhood as property before finally gaining freedom through military occupation rather than her mother's legal authority. The boundaries Philippe tried to cross between free and enslaved, white and black, human and property, still shape American society. Slavery ended legally, but its consequences persist in criminal justice systems, economic inequality, social segregation, in the 1,000 ways that race continues to determine opportunity and survival. Marguerite and Matthias crossed those boundaries briefly, paid for that crossing with years of suffering, and left behind a record that white Louisiana tried to destroy and black communities tried to preserve. Their story didn't change history, but it reveals what history was. It shows the human cost of slavery's logic, the impossibility of maintaining innocence within structures designed to distribute guilt across entire populations. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we can't ask more from these stories than that they show us what people did when trapped between impossible choices, show us the boundaries they tried to cross and the prices they paid. Show us that trying to resist matters even when resistance fails. Marguerite and Matthias tried to be better than the world that shaped them. They failed more than they succeeded. They created damage that their daughter carried for a lifetime, but they tried. And that trying is worth remembering, even when we can't quite determine if it mattered, even when we can't decide if their choices were brave or selfish, resistance or complicity. What do you think? Do you believe they made the right choices? Could anyone make right choices within a system designed to make righteousness impossible? The historical record is incomplete, documents were destroyed, people remembered events differently depending on their positions. Maybe there are pieces we'll never know, truths that died with Marguerite and Matthias and the 11 people who died trying to escape. If you want more stories like this, forgotten chapters of American history that complicate our understanding of slavery, resistance, and the impossible choices people made while trapped in systems that destroyed everyone they touched, then subscribe to The Sealed Room and turn on notifications. Share this with someone who understands that history is messy, that moral clarity is often impossible, that the past was full of people navigating circumstances we can barely imagine. Leave a comment telling me what you think. Did Marguerite and Matthias do the right thing by agreeing to Philippe's plan, or were they doomed from the moment they accepted his terms? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know how you interpret these events. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark corner of American history that most people have never heard about.